I mean, the reason I ask you is because the United States value press freedom and the work of these journalists on the ground, but we don't hear you condemning the killing of Palestinian journalists like you condemn the killing of other journalists in conflict zones.
We absolutely condemn the death of any journalist. We don't want to see any journalist hurt anywhere. Now, when it comes to the specifics of how any one journalist dies, while we object to the killing of any journalist, oftentimes we don't know the circumstance under which they were killed, whether it is an accidental strike, whether they were somewhere where they were covering an incident and there was a militant nearby. It's difficult to speak to the motives behind a strike when we don't know them, but absolutely we condemn the death of any journalist anywhere in the world. Good afternoon, everyone. The Secretary returned this weekend from his latest trip to the Middle East, where he discussed the principles that he outlined early last week as essential for delivering on the aspirations of the Syrian people after the fall of the brutal dictator Bashar al-Assad. Those principles include that the transition process should be Syrian-led and Syrian-owned and produce an inclusive and representative government, that the rights of all Syrians, including women and minorities, should be respected, that humanitarian aid should be able to reach people who need it, that Syria should not be used as a base of for terrorist groups and should have peaceful relations with its neighbors, and that chemical weapons stockpiles should be secured and safely destroyed. In a joint statement, which I hope all of you saw, issued after the meeting of foreign ministers that the Secretary attended in Aqaba, Jordan on Saturday, those principles were endorsed by a number of our partners in the region, as well as a number of countries in Europe and the European Union. Over the coming days, we will continue to engage with actors on the ground in Syria about the importance of adherence to those principles, as well as with our partners in the region and around the world about what they can do to advance those principles as well. As the Secretary said on Saturday, our message to the Syrian people is this: we want them to succeed, and we are prepared to help them do so. And with that, Mary.
Secretary, during the trip also talked about direct communications with HTS. Could you say who from U.S. government talked to who at HTS, and what was the message? What kind of feedback you got?
I'm not going to get into that level of detail, but we have had, I will say, more than one communication with HTS over the past week. And those communications have been largely focused around, let's call them, two buckets of issues. The first is the importance of locating and returning Austin Tice to his family. As you know, that has been a top priority for the United States government. We have a number of people engaged on trying to find Austin Tice and bring him home, and we communicated directly to HTS that anything that they could do to help us find him, we would greatly appreciate, and they committed to do that. The second area of communications has been around the principles that the Secretary laid out publicly early last week, and then you saw countries in the region coalesce around over the weekend. Those are the ones I just went through, making clear to HTS that while we have heard them say in their public statements that they're committed to an open and inclusive and transparent government, that we believe it is important that they actually adhere to that, as well as adhere to these other principles, and that we will be watching them closely over the coming weeks.
Right. So at the moment, it sounds like a number of things are being discussed. Delisting HTS, perhaps potentially an eventual recognition. A lot of these things are somewhat on the table, not immediately. But I'm wondering, you did lay out your principles, but what is the first thing that you need to see from HTS for you to take a step with one of these? And delisting specifically because of the sanctions, it's very hard for any investment to come to Syria right now.
So a few things. Number one, with respect to all of the potential steps that we could take, delisting HTS, removing some of the other sanctions on Syria, formal recognition, all of those we are going to take based on actions, not by statements. So just as a general guiding principle for all of you who are watching how the U.S. will respond, that's what we're going to base our actions on. I'm not going to get into trying to sequence which one of those could come first, or which of those principles we're going to look at to be implemented first by HTS. We think they're all important, but we're watching what they do now, and certainly making clear that they want to be inclusive in dealing with other groups inside Syria. making clear that they respect women and minorities as they stand up interim governing authorities, making clear that Syria won't be used as a base for terrorist groups. We're going to be watching all of those things over the coming weeks.
Okay, a couple of more things. On Austin Tice, you've been in touch with a number of groups that are on the ground in Syria. Has any U.S. government delegation been inside Syria for Austin Tice? Are there any plans for anybody to go?
No U.S. government organization has been on the ground in Syria as of yet. We have been in communication with groups on the ground in Syria, and that includes not just HTS, but other groups in Syria, including the White Helmets, of course, who do a lot of important work on locating detainees, and other civil society groups about the search for Austin Tice. We feel that right now we are able to get good information. I can tell you that over the past week, there have been a number of times, and I think a lot of you know about this because I get questions from you about it sometimes. There have been leads that we have seen that we thought might lead to Austin Tice being located, and we have pursued those. None of those leads have turned out as of yet. I know at times you guys have found leads and reported on the possible location of Austin. So we are getting information about what's happening inside Syria, and we are able to pursue those leads now and able to run them down. And as it pertains to when someone from the State Department might actually be on the ground in Syria, I don't have anything to announce today, but of course, stay tuned.
Okay, a couple of final things. Have you have any of the information you received from the contacts on the ground in Syria, have you received anything that would reinforce your working assumption that Austin Tice is alive?
I'm just not going to get into the underlying information that we have. This has obviously been something we have been watching for some time, right? We've been trying to get him home for years. And I think it's best that I not speak to kind of our underlying assessments. As the president said, we believe he's live. We're trying to locate him. I don't have any new information.
Okay. And Secretary today had a meeting with the family of Aysenur Ezgi, the Turkish-American woman who was killed by Israeli military in West Bank. We understand the family has asked again for an independent U.S. criminal investigation into the killing. But we understand the Secretary made no promises. So can you talk a little bit about that meeting and why the U.S. isn't basically giving that assurance that it will look into the killing of one of its citizens?
Sure. I will talk a little bit about that meeting. I'm not going to talk about it in detail because it was a private meeting with the family. The Secretary in that meeting offered, once again, his deepest condolences to the family for Aysenur's death. It was a death that never should have happened, as he has said previously. He told them that Israel has told us in recent days that they are finalizing their investigation into the matter, and he committed to them that as soon as we learn anything about the results of that investigation, we will report it to them. And then with respect to a United States investigation, it's not a matter that the State Department can undertake or a matter that we can speak to. As you know, when it comes to that type of investigation, that would be in the remit of the Justice Department. We have an independent Justice Department for a reason inside our government, so it's ultimately something for the Justice Department to speak to. And the State Department can't speak on behalf of an independent law enforcement agency as to what they may be doing or what they might do or might not do.
But just final thing, is it your opinion? I understand you cannot speak for DOJ, but would you say that it would be appropriate for the U.S. government to carry out its own investigation?
So to answer that question, I would have to violate one of the principles that at least this administration has felt is pretty sacrosanct, which is the independence of law enforcement investigations and other branches of the government not trying to put themselves in the shoes and speak for or encourage action by what is, for very good reasons, an independent law enforcement agency. Yeah, Nick.
Clarify something. You just said no U.S. government organization has been on the ground in Syria since the fall of Assad. That's strictly with respect to searching for Austin Tice, correct?
So there are not. Yes, of course. There is the longstanding military personnel that's been there in that counter ISIS mission. I wasn't speaking to that. I'm speaking to with respect to diplomatic and other personnel that might have been engaged in the search for Austin Tice or other diplomatic activities. Yeah.
Yeah, just to follow up on something Humaira said, and then you said the French are sending a delegation to Damas, to Syria. The Brits are doing the same. Could you just give us a reason why you would not want to, at this stage, I mean, there seems obvious reasons, but I'd like to hear you say it, why you wouldn't be sending a direct delegation rather than the context that you've had?
Let me just say two things about that. Number one, we have had the ability to date to be able to communicate with all of the relevant parties on the ground in Syria, including HTS. And the second thing is I'm not ruling out that we won't send personnel to Damascus. Stay tuned over the coming days.
Why are you not ready to do so right now?
I didn't say that we weren't. We haven't seen any as of yet, and we will continue to assess the situation.
Are they on
we
the
will
way?
no. There's no one there. There's no one on the way. We'll continue to assess the situation, and when we decide it's appropriate to send personnel in, I'll come out and make an announcement about it.
Okay. Another question related on Netanyahu on Sunday. The Israeli government approved the doubling of the population in the Golan Heights, which of course they've annexed. There's a lot of backlash against that from all different sides and partners. What are the U.S. thoughts on that?
Look, our policy with respect to the Golan Heights hasn't changed. I don't have any comment on the announcement of people moving from inside Israel to the Golan Heights.
You don't think it potentially, I mean, given the timing and all of this, that it could complicate things in terms of Syria more larger?
So these are not people.
At this point in stage, you have everyone seems to want a piece of Syria right
Yeah, so
now.
these are not-
Everyone is involved.
These are not people who are moving to the buffer zone that is covered under the 1974 disengagement agreement. And we have made quite clear our opinion about the buffer zone is that we ought to believe it ought to be upheld. Israel has said that the deployment of forces into that buffer zone is temporary. We believe that deployment ought to be temporary, and the 1974 disengagement agreement ought to be upheld. And if you look at the statement that the United States signed on to, along with our partners in the region and a number of European countries on Saturday, it called for the upholding of Syria's territorial integrity, and we stand by that position. Go ahead.
Latest update on the hostage negotiations in Gaza. It seems like there's a lot of optimism, but is
I'll take that, and I'll come. Go ahead.
on the region. So there's been a lot of optimism, but do you see a deal in the offing, and is it a deal that the U.S. finds productive for moving to a post-conflict era?
So the negotiations have been productive in recent days. We have continued to try to work with the other mediators to narrow the differences. We have been down this road so many times before, though. It's hard to stand here and say we're optimistic about it because we are very much realistic about how difficult it has been to reach a deal. There are really, and this has been true for some time, there are a very small number of differences that remain between the parties, and we continue to believe that those differences can be bridged. We continue to work to bridge those differences. The secretary, in his meetings with President Erdogan and the foreign minister of Turkey last week, Hakan Fidan, emphasized to them that any influence that they have with Hamas, now is the time to use it. And I can tell you that the foreign minister came back 24 hours later when he saw the secretary in Aqaba and said that they had been pushing for a deal. And we know, of course, that Egypt and Qatar, who have relationships with Hamas, have been pushing Hamas for a deal. We are not leaving anything. We are pushing as hard as we know how to do at this point, and we believe we can get to a deal. But again, it remains incumbent on Hamas and Israel agreeing to those final terms and getting it over the line. And I can't in good conscience stand here and tell you that that's going to happen, but it should happen.
Syria?
Yeah, go. Jenny, we'll stick with Jenny, and then we'll go.
Matt, are you conveying to HTS that they need to expel all Russian troops as perhaps contingent to lifting sanctions that as we've heard from the EU
I'm not going to get into the conversations that we've had with them. Ultimately, as you heard me say last week, the disposition of those 2 Russian bases inside Syria is a matter for the Syrian people to decide. But when you look at Russia's history inside Syria, it is one of being complicit in the massacre of hundreds of thousands of Syrian civilians. Russia propped up the brutal, murderous regime that gassed its own people, that murdered its own people, and so certainly I think that Russia has a lot to answer for its actions inside Syria.
So would you consider not lifting sanctions until there is an expulsion of Russian troops?
So I'm not going to get into our internal deliberation process, but we have made clear what the factors are that we are looking at, and they are factors that largely relate to the Syrian government's interaction with its own people, as well as things like not threatening its neighbors and not being a base for terrorism.
And then I have another on transition if you want to come back.
Yeah, I'll come back to you. Nadia.
Syria and Gaza, but on Syria, just going back to Austin Tice, there were some reports indicating that he might be actually in Iran or Iraq, or might be taken by Maher al-Assad, which is the brother of Bashar. Any truth to these reports that you know of?
No, not that I'm aware of. I haven't seen those reports, and I can't speak to their veracity.
Information that he is in Syria.
We do not have specific information about where he is. We continue to work to try to locate him, but we don't have specific information about his whereabouts, or we would have been able to verify that information already.
Okay. The attacks that carried by Israel is almost 450. One of the biggest attacks was yesterday. It was described like an earthquake bomb. The leader of HTS said that he is not seeking conflict with Israel. Do you still believe that these attacks are justified?
Look, so Israel has spoken to why they have launched these attacks. They've said that they are concerned at a time of great instability, when you have the government of Syria that has fallen and an uncertain path ahead about who is going to control Syria and who is going to control the Assad regime's quite significant military stockpiles, that they have taken steps to ensure that those stockpiles don't fall into the hands of terrorists. Now, we have been in conversation with them about that goal. We also believe it's important that no party take any actions that would further destabilize the situation in Syria at a time when we want to push to increase stability, and we'll continue to have that discussion with them.
And just on Gaza, another journalist, a colleague of us, has been killed yesterday. That brings the number of journalists being killed in Gaza to 196. How many times we can ask the same questions that journalists in Gaza needed to be protected, and how many incidents we're still waiting for the Israelis to be investigated and for you to come back to us and said, this person's held accountable for the killing of Muhammad
So
Baluch.
journalists in Gaza absolutely need to be protected. When it comes to Israeli government investigations, you should ask the government of Israel that question. We obviously engaged with them about that and pressed for answers, but you were certainly welcome to do so as well. Those are Israeli government investigations, but we have made clear that when it comes to journalists, they need to be protected. I will tell you, ultimately, the answer to this is to get a ceasefire, which is why we continue to push for a ceasefire. The journalists that are operating in Gaza are doing so with incredible heroism. All of us in this room, including in many cases the United States government, know what we know about actions on the ground because there are journalists there that are reporting on it. The U.S. doesn't have any personnel on the ground to verify reports, so we rely on journalists to bring that information forward, and we rely on the work that they do. But as long as it is an active conflict zone, journalists are going to be at risk the same way other civilians are going to be at risk, which is why we believe the ultimate answer to this question is to reach a ceasefire, and why we continue to use all of the diplomatic muscle that we can bring to bear to try to get one over the line.
Sure. I mean, the reason I ask you is because the United States value press freedom and the work of the journalists on the ground, but we don't hear you condemning the killing of Palestinian journalists like you condemn the killing of other journalists in conflict zones.
We absolutely condemn the death of any journalist. We don't want to see any journalist hurt anywhere. Now, when it comes to the specifics of how any one journalist dies, while we object to the killing of any journalist, oftentimes we don't know the circumstance under which they were killed, whether it is an accidental strike, whether they were somewhere where they were covering an incident and there was a militant nearby. It's difficult to speak to the motives behind a strike when we don't know them, but absolutely we condemn the death of any journalist anywhere in the world.
Okay, and the killing of civilians, there was a grandfather of a girl that was killed a year ago called Dream, 2-year-old. The grandfather was killed yesterday. His name is Khalid Nabhan. And he became an icon because he was very close to his granddaughter, and he was killed as well in Nusayrat camp yesterday. Do you still think that this is also random killing? It was an incident that needed to be investigated. How these civilians are dying every single day, whether it's 50 or 60, it's a number that we keep repeating all the time in every briefing.
I think that there continue to be unspeakable tragedies happening in Gaza every day. Not just the death of civilians, the maiming of civilians, the people who find it difficult to get enough to eat, the people that find it difficult to get access to medical care. It is an ongoing tragedy, and the answer to stopping that tragedy is to reach a ceasefire, which doesn't just require acquiescence by Israel, it requires acquiescence by Hamas. And that is what has been so difficult to get over the past 7 months, well, more than that, 7 months since the president outlined the ceasefire proposal that we put on the table, but we've been pushing to get a ceasefire since long before that. There are two parties that have to agree to a ceasefire. And I know everyone always asks me questions in this briefing room about actions by the government of Israel, but there are two parties to this conflict. And they both have to agree to this ceasefire. And we will continue to push both parties to come to an agreement precisely because the tragic deaths that you laid out, quite rightfully, continue to happen and need to stop.
Thank you.
I'll come to
just to follow up on the journalists. 190 journalists. That's all by accidental, you think?
I can't speak to any of those incidents without having full information. But ultimately, Saeed, every one of those deaths is a tragedy, which is why we need to stop more deaths from happening, which is why we need to get a ceasefire.
No, I understand. I just want, you don't think that all of them are accidents?
I don't offer. So, Saeed, I don't offer opinions based on speculation from this podium.
Right.
I offer them based on conclusions that we're able to reach after looking at a full assessment of incidents.
Okay. Following up on the talks that you explained just a little while ago, the Israeli Ma'arif newspaper just came out with a report that basically Egypt has reached an agreement with Hamas on some sort of a transitional committee that is not Hamas, that could run Gaza and look after things and so on. Would that be acceptable to you?
I'm not going to speak to that report. I'm not aware of it, but I can tell you we have been having conversations with a number of parties in the region for some time, which you know because I've spoken to them from this podium before, about what the post-conflict period ought to look like in Gaza, including what governance ought to look like. We've made clear that the status quo as it existed before October 7th cannot continue. Gaza cannot continue to be governed by Hamas. But as to what the governance looks like, not something I can speak to today.
Okay, because Netanyahu said today, told the court that he will not be able to attend tomorrow, and normally there's something, maybe big. Do you expect there may be an announcement tomorrow on a ceasefire?
I have no idea why he's not able to attend the court hearing tomorrow.
Couple questions on the Palestinian issue. Israel is deploying dozens of autonomous weapons all throughout the West Bank that basically will not be able to discriminate between a perpetrator or a civilian and so on. Doesn't that make every Palestinian in the West Bank potentially a target?
I can't speak to that particular deployment, but I would say when it comes to the use of any weapons, that our expectations are the same, that Israel must fully comply with international humanitarian law and protect civilian life.
All right. On the aid, the Financial Times, I guess, reported that aid is at its lowest point, despite what you're saying that they a lot. Can you explain to us the aid situation now?
It continues to be extremely challenging. We have seen some improvements. There were a number of days last week when we saw hundreds of trucks go in, but then you have other days that the aid level is much lower. Continue to be barriers to the delivery of aid inside Gaza that we work to try to overcome. But it continues to be really a crisis situation, and I think ultimately the conclusion that we have drawn is like the ongoing deaths of civilians in an active conflict zone, the provision of aid in an active conflict zone is very difficult, and it's another reason why it's so critical that we reach a ceasefire.
Let me ask you on the appointment of ambassadors. The coming administration named Mark Huckabee as ambassador to Israel, and Israel named Leiter, who is a well-known, Kahanist, and as ambassador to Washington. So I want to ask you, I mean, doesn't it seem like, maybe the whole diplomatic, U.S.-Israel diplomatic engagement will focus on maybe settlements and annexation and so on with these two? And
You mean the post-January 20th diplomatic
January
engagement?
20th, yeah, of course I'm asking you. I mean, you always say that there's, one president at a time, one administration at a time, and we always say the same thing. But is there anything where you can actually say, we will not accept? I mean, if he comes, I don't know when Leiter is coming to Washington, but maybe something that, this is not a good idea. Or
So-
issue a statement that this is not.
First of all, let me just say, with respect to other countries, they are free and open to appoint ambassadors as they see fit. It's not a decision for the United States. And when it comes for the policies that will be pursued by the Trump administration and the personnel appointed by the Trump administration, it's just not something that I should speak to. I'm happy to speak to our ambassadorial appointments, but not those being made by the Trump administration.
But you do have a view. I mean, this is U.S. diplomacy at its finest.
I have a view that it is my job to stand up here and speak on behalf of the personnel that President Biden has appointed and the policies that he is going to pursue, and not opine on whatever policy positions an administration that I will not speak for may choose to pursue.
Okay, so in principle, you think that the United States of America should have no say-so on the, as far as the character of said ambassador is, whatever crimes he may have committed, and whatever, it's all acceptable?
If we started trying to pick and choose and opine on every ambassador that 200 countries around the world appoint to the United States, we would be in this briefing room for a very long time every day. So